I'm delighted to welcome you for a conversations event here at Art Science Museum that marks the launch of the exhibition 2219 Futures Imagined. My name's Honor Harger and I'm the Executive Director of Art Science Museum. This exhibition 2219 is curated by my team here at Art Science Museum as part of the Singapore Bicentennial. The show takes the time frame of the Singapore Bicentennial, 200 years, and projects it forward, exploring how our world might change over this time period. It places visitors in scenarios that explore how our future lives may be impacted by climate change and the loss of the planet's diversity. 2219 includes work by nearly 30 artists, designers, writers and architects from around the world. And today, we're going to be focusing on the ideas raised by one of the key protagonists in the exhibition, the acclaimed artist and filmmaker, John Akomfrah. Shortly, John is going to be introducing his iconic work, Purple, and the environmental issues which inspired it. John's talk is going to be followed by a panel discussion where we'll be joined by our second contributor for today, Professor Ute Meta Bauer, Founding Director of the NTU Centre for Contemporary Art, or CCA. The panel will explore the ecological turn within contemporary art practice, referencing themes in our exhibition 2219 and the ideas explored in the show opening this weekend at CCA, The Post-Human City, Climates, Habitats, Environments. It's fitting that John's work opens 2219. The exhibition looks at the future through the lens of climate change, showing how environmental issues may shape our future. The global transformations brought about by rising sea levels, an increasingly warm planet, and the loss of nature provide a backdrop for us to explore how daily life, culture, society, and our traditions may evolve over the next 2 centuries. 2219 asks visitors to reflect on what kind of future they want and what kind of actions they may be prepared to take today to bring that future into being. The exhibition begins with John's work, Purple. This remarkable 6-channel installation addresses climate change, human communities, and the wilderness. To make it, John combined hundreds of hours of archival footage with newly shot film and a hypnotic score to document humanity's destructive impact on the planet. So we're going to begin this afternoon by watching a short clip of Purple, and then I'll take the stage after that and I'll introduce John to speak a little bit more about the work. But first, let's take a look at Purple. So hopefully you've been able to see with just that tiny fragment of what is a much, much larger work, just how evocative this artwork is of the changing state of our environment. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the artist who created Purple, John Akomfrah. John is an artist and filmmaker from the UK whose works investigate memory, post-colonialism, and the experiences of migrant diasporas globally. John was a founding member of the highly influential Black Audio Film Collective, which started in London in 1982, alongside the artist David Lawson, who's also with us today. Over the course of his career, John has shown in numerous major museums and galleries around the world, including holding solo shows at the Baltic in the UK, the New Museum in New York, and San Francisco MoMA, to name but just a few. But this exhibition here is John's first show in Asia. Much of John's recent work, including Purple, reflects on the intertwined relationship between humanity's destruction of the natural world and our destruction of ourselves. As one curator put it, John's artistic voice alerts us to the dangers that are threatening global ecosystems and the beauty that we're about to lose. To tell us more about Purple and the ideas behind the work, please welcome to the stage John Akomfrah.
Thank you very much for coming. Not a huge amount to say, partly because I think it's probably better for you to see works than hear artists talking about it. But there are a few things worth noting. And one is to do with this phrase that we heard from the introduction, the ecological turn. Now, it seems to me that many of the artists whose works are impaled on this phrase, this conceptual category, struggle with two things. Two things that have ethical and aesthetic implications. And I just want to drill down on those two a bit because I think that might help situate Purple slightly more. When we were editing Purple, I had stuck on my wall one of the suggestive paragraphs from the last century, and it's from Antonio Gramsci's Prison Notebooks. And the paragraph went something like, the crisis consists precisely of the fact that the old is dying and the new can't be born, or is not yet born. And in this interregnum, this gap, morbid symptoms appear. In a way, the ecological turn for me is about the ethical recognition of the interregnum, of the fact that the climate crisis we are living through is but a kind of gap in a space of becoming. We're definitely not in the disaster. We are on our way to something. We think it's a disaster, but it's important to be attendant of the space that we're in now. And so my feeling is that you could probably call the ecological turn an attempt to find the poetics of the interregnum, if that makes any sense. Now, the poetics of the interregnum has ethical and aesthetic implications, especially for my work anyway. The aesthetic implications are that we suddenly find ourselves in a space where other sources outside of the space of the interregnum offer models for our practices. One of the ones I turn to is the semiologies of memory, and in particular, something I mentioned yesterday, which is to do with the systems of mourning death in Ghanaian West African culture. Indigo is one of the 4 systems of color that people call upon in an attempt to acknowledge our obligations to the dead. So purple being one of the strands of the indigo spectrum became a kind of metonym for the work that I'm doing, that became purple. The other is to do with light. This is a slightly banal thing to say, but it is true that oftentimes we do works in moving image practice which privileges 2 extremes, either 2 extremes of light as desirable entities. One is dusk and the other is dawn. And both of them have very particular takes of light of Kelvin in the light scale. Yeah, both kind of gorgeous. By gorgeous, we mean basically golden. Now, post the gold, there's always the indigo. But most of us don't hang around long enough to watch the indigo. Most of us don't stay long enough to watch the purple. The purple is what happens just before the night comes. And so there's a way in which the indigo of light, the light of indigo, is the quintessential light of the interregnum. And that's why it appeals to me so much. There is what I would call an ethics of the interregnum. And that has to do with something the images say to us. My practice is very research-based. I watch a lot of stuff. And what you would see in the archive that interlaced the clip that we showed you was that there's a way in which images are kind of a promissory note to ourselves. Images are claims, if you like, to immortality. It's the ways in which we remind ourselves that there are futures. So a filmmaker shoots a documentary about the North in 1954, and I watch it in 2013 for this. And there are all kinds of ghosts, phantoms that he and his team just hadn't seen, but I can't avoid seeing now. There's carbon monoxide everywhere. Almost try it. Just try it as an exercise. Go to any library and get out any films from the 60s or 50s. And you're just appalled by the amount of poison around. I mean, it's just everywhere. The unseen guests of every image. And so there's a way in which the immortality that the image promised us came with this message of doom. And one of the things I wanted to do was to find a way of honoring this message. You know, finding a way of giving, complimenting, if you like, this message that someone had sent to me 50 years ago, which will probably be around when I'm gone, and certainly when most of you are gone. If that film is looked after, it would outlive us and climate change. So it will be this incredible record of something we left to ourselves. And it seems to me that that recognition is part of the ethic of the interregnum. It's the recognition that we are now in a space of a certain kind of partiality, which our knowledges are conditioned by things beyond our control. The second bit of the ethic, which is very important to the structure of the piece, is the sense that the ghosts and the phantoms of these images that I'm watching necessarily means that the acknowledgement of being ecological is also an acknowledgement of our limits, of the things we don't quite control. And the things we don't quite control can be histories, identities, narratives, if you will. And so Purple took the form that it did because it was an attempt to find a home for this recognition of difference and of our limitations and our limits. That sounds like my 10 minutes, doesn't it? I'll stop there. Take a seat.
Thank you very much, John, for that insight. And I really do urge all of you who haven't had the opportunity to experience the work to come and visit the exhibition when it opens tomorrow and sit with Purple, because in some ways it almost acts as a preparatory act kind of for what happens kind of elsewhere in the exhibition, but also as a way of almost coming to terms kind of with the change that we're living through in terms of climate change and the loss of biodiversity. So now that we've heard from John, it's my pleasure to be introducing our second contributor of today, Professor Ute Meta Bauer. She's the founding director of the NTU Centre for Contemporary Art, or CCA, here in Singapore. Ute, of course, is a curator who works with film, video and sound with a focus on interdisciplinary research. She's been the director of the CCA since 2013, and prior to that, she's held senior positions at the Royal College of Art in London, MIT in Boston, and the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. She was the co-curator of Documenta 11 in 2001, co-director of the World Biennial Forum in Gwangju, the artistic director of the third Berlin Biennale, and the co-curator of the US Pavilion for the 56th Venice Biennale, featuring the great Joan Jonas. Ute's work in recent times has investigated climate change and human interventions into the environment. And we've asked her here today to reflect on the most recent exhibition that she's put together at the CCA, which is opening this evening. And it's called The Post-Human City: Climates, Habitats, Environments. Like 2219, this show presents a range of contemporary artists whose work responds to environmental issues. So please help me welcome Ute Meta Bauer. So we've asked both of you to come on stage together to speak a little bit more about what kind of John very eloquently referred to earlier as this ecological turn within contemporary art. And I know that this is something which has been a consideration within your curatorial practice of late, Ute, and I wonder if you could kick us off by just saying a few words about the exhibition that you've curated, which opens this evening, and some of the themes which underlie it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here, and also I'm so happy to share the stage also with John. But I want to start when, of course, we had the Biennale, and so we tried, we said, like, let's be good citizens and talk a little bit what we're all doing in this time. And so my team, we met with Honor and Adrian, and I said, so what you do to the Biennale, what are we doing? And we figured out we are both actually looking into our futures, into climate anxiety, and I think that's really a good thing because it should bother all of us. So we said also let's really see this, that it really engraves this even more. And why we are engaging in these topics is we see our students also confronted with climate change anxieties, children. I see many artists who are engaged in that, so it's not that I would say, oh, this is now something I should engage with. I see it around me, and then I usually say, so how can we contribute? How can we make this crisis more tangible? To languages that are other than the scientific languages. They very often don't reach a wider public. They are too specialized and too abstract often. So it does not replace these languages, but I think it's interesting to juxtapose them. And I think this is also, we are part of a university, we are a research center. So in which way do we contribute as a research center in the arts to what is happening at our campus? And in which way do we interact with the public, with the information that we also have?
Thanks, Ute. In the introduction to the show that you're opening this evening, you've quoted the philosopher Rosi Braidotti, who wrote, "Sustainability does assume faith in a future." and also a sense of responsibility for passing on to future generations a world that's livable and worth living in, a present that endures as a sustainable model of the future. This is an idea that I think very much connects kind of the two shows at CCA and here. So I wonder if I could ask you both to comment on why you feel that as artists and also as a curator who works with artists, this idea has become so urgent and interesting for the arts. I guess the idea that a kind of an engagement with sustainability sort of assumes an interest and a faith in the future.
I mean, you know, it feels like a really good time to be working at the moment. I'm not sure about living, but certainly working, you know. Because the ecological turn seems to me to be partly an embrace of a kind of intersectional understanding of the universe, you know? It's like the minute you invoke the geologic, you're simultaneously talking about the history of extractive capitalism, racialized bodies, you know, I mean, the whole thing. And so it's a really interesting way, it seems to me, for reconfiguring what we mean by we, as Timothy Morton says. It's a really interesting moment to both propose a we and interrogate what we mean by the we. So I'm not involved in this because I think it banishes the emergency of it, banishes all notions of difference. I'm interested in this because through this looking at the we again, where we're going, where we are, where we've come from, we can arrive at new understandings of difference, you know, which is important because the emergency is not being felt in the same way everywhere, you know. So it's just silly to pretend that it is, you know. I mean, Venice was underwater 2 weeks ago, London's dry. And those differences are important. They're not just cosmetic.
I think it's also, as you say, to look into the wider perspective. And I mean, if we talk about the climate crisis, it's, for example, not different than to discuss post-colonial conditions, talk about capitalist systems. I mean, like another very important reference, of course, is Donna Haraway, and when she talks about staying in the trouble and talking about the Capitalocene. So why is our planet in this phase? What is the reason for that? And that is the continuous extraction, exploitation, etc. You mentioned, like, if we look back 50 years, how did our industrialized planet look then? I mean, it might have looked worse. And of course, if we talk about the nuclear, I mean, what is the aftermath of the nuclear? It will take such long time even to cut back radiation. So I think it's not something that suddenly starts. There's a very, very long history involved, and the question to me is now really, what can we contribute to really come to an action? You know, like we have to change fundamentally the way we live and also the way we live together, and what is maybe new and or like that we really understand in an anthropocenic moment that we cannot be anthropocentric in this way. We have to talk about sharing, and not only, we also talked, this morning we had also a discussion where we said, how do we address also a massive climate migration that we soon will see? Can we be hospital, or do we close our doors? Do we build walls? Do we cut back on basically the refugees we let in? And it's heartening to see what happens still in Lampedusa, or the news we had, like people in trucks are dying. And I think the world is in a crisis since long. And the question is really, in what way can we, when we still live in a very comfortable and privileged situation, kind of say we also have to change something? And I think purple and also other art, it really makes it tangible. What are we losing through the way we're living?
I want to come back to you, John, because in the last couple of days you've made a couple of references to almost how you've observed people feeling kind of with purple. And in your short talk before, you referenced purple as being a colour of mourning within the West African tradition. But specifically, the phase of mourning where we are wakeful during the wake of the person who's passed, which of course is a moment for commemorating and celebrating a life, as well as, kind of mourning its passing. So I just wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit on that idea.
I mean, what I was partly clumsily trying to say in my opening address was that it seems to me that the poetics of the interregnum, which the ecological turn is sort of about, comes with a recognition of afterlives. Like the whole thing is this sense that as I'm looking at this archive, I can see stuff which are alive after the fact of the, and one way in which I'm trying to use that, and I'm not the only one by any means, is to return to the question of affect from a slightly different angle, to return to the question of affect from the vantage point of knowing afterlife. Now, one of the implications of that for me is to broaden our understanding of the demos, so that species that are allowed into the parliament of affects can include others, other than ourselves. That seems to me to be one of the recognitions that we have to make. So I'm interested in systems for codifying affects that allow for that decentralizing and the sharing, the decentralizing of subjectivity, if you like, so that we can begin to honestly have a conversation in our works about who is feeling this. I watched, for the last thing that I did for Venice, like this incredible sequence that a lot of people have seen now because it was in a very, very famous natural history program. But you watch this episode of an elephant cub dying, and its mum and broader family go into this wake for it. And you realize that the wake, i.e. honoring our obligation to the dead by vigilance to life, is necessary, and not just for us, but for other species. And the minute I sensed that, it changed my whole attitude to the wake. And now, let's stop there, because otherwise it becomes something else.
I guess,
Sorry.
one of the other, functions of a wake, which is why I found that kind of idea so powerful, is it's the phase of mourning where you almost start coming to terms with, kind of the grief and what's been lost. You're confronting it and sitting with it and starting to be with it, so that you can, make the next steps out into the future. And so that feels like a very important idea right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Inviting the dead into you seems to me to be a necessary prerequisite of the wake as well. So, the recognition that we're somehow custodians of Anthropocenic time is also simultaneously the recognition that we're necessarily the inheritors of all of that. And it's not just my father who passed away when I was 4, my mother who went when I was 20, but, the countless other species that perished on the Savo in these man-made, droughts over Africa in the last 6 decades. I am embodied by all these passings, and those passings have implications that I need to work through and work with, and that for me is what the wake means. That for me is.
Ute, John mentioned Anthropocenic times and how I guess we can try as people who exist within the arts and within interdisciplinary kind of spaces within the arts to deal better kind of with the responsibility of living in the Anthropocenic times. I think this is very much a topic that you're exploring in the show that you're opening tonight. So I just wonder if you can speak a little bit about maybe some of the practices which are represented in that show and how you're observing kind of various artists being able to navigate kind of space within the Anthropocene.
Yeah, I mean, for those who are not so familiar with the term, the Anthropocene is actually a geological term, and it marks for geologists, and there was long discussions if we are still in the Holocene or now in the Anthropocene. It marks the moment when you can basically see massive human intervention in our Earth's geology, and this is basically when you can see nuclear testing, when you can measure radiation in our geology. So, and this is what I said, this marks a new age when we can see changes in the environment that are man-made, not the natural course. And so it is very interesting to now look into these impacts. They happened before, but they were not in that sense measurable in geological terms. So we also have, it's artists, architects, designers we have in the show. We have a series of films, we have also talks, and it's on the one side, like for example, Lucy and Jorge Orta, they're looking into water recycling. Water is so important, and in Singapore we know that because a lot of the water is imported or comes from desalination. And what water do we leave to people, like privatization of water? So, but they also look very simple in water filter systems. Another really interesting example is one of my former students at MIT, actually in the art program, but she came out of biochemistry as an undergraduate. She really has now a business as an artist, but it's a cotton burial suit. She looks into green burials because she says like this notion of death denial, for example, causes a lot of use of formaldehyde in the burial industry. Like we're getting embalmed, we have to look young even in death. The coffin, so, and also there's a very high cancer rate in the profession of professionals working in this industry. So she developed a cotton suit that is has mushroom spores drunken into a liquid. So, and these mushroom spores help to decompose the body, but also to detox the body. Mushrooms have dysfunction. Everybody who knows Chinese medicine knows that. And so it's also, she said, we have to look also, human bodies cause toxins, buildings actually create toxins. We have to look into solutions, but we also have a work by the French artist Pierre Huyghe, The Human Mask, where basically a monkey, Fukushan, who works as a waiter in a bar in Japan. He filmed him in the aftermath of Fukushima in this emptied out landscape where there is no human life. The landscape is still there. Actually, very often, as we experienced in the Pacific, after a nuclear testing, we leave landscapes alone. Actually, nature flourishes. It's very beautiful there. So we always think it looks like doomsday, but it's amazing. So, so we try to give different entry points, and it's wonderful that here is more entry points. So we said we cannot do enough to really start a wider discussion on those topics.
Thank you, Ute. You mentioned just in passing the Pacific, and I wanted to ask you both about the engagement that you've had with the TBA 21 Academy, which facilitates these extraordinary expeditions of discovery for both artists, scientists, and thought leaders. Both of you, in the course of your work, have gone on journeys, either for research purposes or, in John's case, of course, to shoot. And I guess I'd like to hear from both of you on how those expeditions changed your approach to art making, to curatorial research, how they may have kind of shifted your awareness about, you know, kind of the sort of the state of the planet. Maybe John, you could go first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, TBA 21 is this extraordinary organization who were absolutely central to the production of Purple because I wanted to get to the Marshall Islands for precisely the reasons that Ute was talking about, which is there is this way in which, you know, from images I saw of Chernobyl, when we vacate spaces, others move in great droves. You know? So I wanted to see how that was working. But in a way, that didn't happen. I didn't get to the Marshall Islands because the trip with TBA 21 taught me something that we had started to practice, but it sort of became more of a solid possibility in the work, which is to be more attendant to the wavelengths and language and vernaculars of place, you know, because in the past, say in the 80s, I had tended to, and we had tended to go to a place and ask it questions, you know, what it can tell us about racial oppression, etc., etc. You know, now I'm much more interested first in asking what it wants me to hear or see, or, you know. So it fits perfectly with the TBA approach, which is to inhabit a place for a time, usually a long time, and then see what it is from that place that you're feeling. So much of all the journeys, the boat journeys in Purple, came about on this journey. I just thought, actually, you know, this is a sort of interesting kind of metaphor for our project. We're making a project on 5 chapters of life, and each chapter involves a journey from one to the other, and, you know, so we incorporated their emphasis on deep time into the work that we were doing in a very useful way.
Ute, you've had many expeditions and in recent times quite profound ones. I wonder if you could just reflect a bit on your experience.
I mean, I got on this ship first when I was at MIT, and they did some fittings for the ship. It was in the harbor in Boston, and I knew Francesca von Habsburg. Because she has also art foundation that does productions, Thyssen-Bornemisza 21, and so when she was there with the boat, and I had one of the artists to perform at MIT who did hydrophonic recordings with the ship actually in the north, in the ice, Jana Winderen. And then Francesca asked, oh, maybe we can invite some scientists, some people, and listen to recordings. So that is how it started, and she asked me a few years later, she said, oh, we're starting now TBA Academy, and we want to do these expeditions with the ship into the Pacific. Would you serve at this? And then I got a bit nervous, because I'm not necessarily an ocean person, and I felt it's a bit of a cliche to go on an expedition, and I felt really bad. And then they told me the first destination is Papua New Guinea, and I felt even worse. But then, arriving there, if you read about Papua New Guinea, it says it's one of the world's poorest countries, has one of the lowest per capita incomes, and Port Moresby, the homicide rate is huge, and then you arrive and it's a country with one of the biggest biodiversity on this planet. There is almost 800 languages spoken in this country, and we talk about one of the poorest countries. So it profoundly changed also my reading of, and of course I had already questions to Western value system, but it definitely made me asking twice the systems that we believe. And it also teaches you that even an atoll with 100 people living there, even an atoll with maybe only animals living there, is of significance of our ecosystem on this planet. So I think I really learned a lot about that, and I think that made me also, that urged me also to say we have to make this more tangible. And particularly in Singapore, we're an island, but we forget that we're an island in the ocean. We forget about the ocean here and how important this ocean is for us. It's not just a source of exploitation. And so I think this, to being exposed also to the force of nature makes me hopeful, because I think nature is still stronger than us. So there is some hope, but it definitely changes your perception of the environment.
Thank you. So I would like to open up to the floor now for comments or questions or thoughts kind of from the audience. We've got a microphone. I think we've got our first question down here. We've probably got time for about 2 or 3 questions.
Okay. Thank you for doing this, and welcome, John, to Singapore. I think I look forward to seeing your work tomorrow. I think this is an important discussion, and I wondered if you would go back and talk about time a little bit more. I think if you spend enough time in Singapore, you'll find that we are afraid of everything. We are afraid of now this rising sea levels. In fact, I told my son, stay in Canada. When I die in my apartment, take all the stuff and sell the apartment. So we're afraid of that, and we're also afraid of food, our food supply and all that. So I guess my question is not just for you to talk about time, but talk about time in the sense that is there either a sequel to Purple, or are you traveling through some sort of time tunnel where, I mean, even the image behind you looks like you're about to see Jesus, right? Right. So it's like there's light, and then this, and then you're talking about trying to not be so afraid of death and doom, and that this is okay, this is natural. So the sea levels are going to go up, and we're going to be all right, and we're going to be better people. So in your mind, is that kind of covered in Purple, or is there like a Purple 2 coming up?
Interesting. Thank you. I don't have an answer for you, but maybe just some reflections to add to the ongoing ones that we all have. I mean, when I'm looking for material, the work is very research-based, as I said, and so you find that you're making connections with things across periods of time. So if, for instance, I go to the archive to look for carbon monoxide fumes, I will find images for it in 45, 55, 75, etc., etc. So part of the challenge is to persuade all of these different times with their own authoritarian kind of tyrannies, because of course all times believe they are special. We all believe we live in special times. Persuading all these different times to coexist so that we might have a narrative of decline or a narrative of catastrophe is part of the challenge of work like this. I have to believe that the privileging of multiple temporalities and multiple frames is part of the pleasure of the work. And if I believe that, hopefully I can pass that on to you, and you might believe it as well. I'm not going to do a purple 2 because the work has already poisoned me. I can't go back now. It's like a fatal insight into things, into the fact that actually the Anthropocenic means that this opening of the natural and the cultural, which ushered in our modernity, is closing. Actually, so we are now entering into pagan time, where it's going to be more difficult to make these distinctions between what is natural, so-called, and what is cultural. And just that insight alone is a major starting point for almost everything that I'm working on now, you know. I know.
That's such a great phrase, pagan time.
Well, I mean,
but okay, so without sounding like Lion King, right? Aren't there cycles?
Ute, I think you had something to add here.
I just wanted to, when we spoke about this exhibition, we discovered not only that we work on a similar topic, we also realized we're both working on a show that includes John. So you will not maybe see a sequel in the future, but you see a prior work by John in our next show, which looks into the Stuart Hall project. And it kind of connects again to what you do now. It's also research-based. It also looks also much more into the colonial. Also, what does this mean for the project of an individual like Stuart Hall, and coming from the Caribbean, coming out of a long history of slavery, and so it kind of it's like a narration that goes on and on. So I think it's also important maybe to look further back, and so I think to see also, again, we also said it's great. We will not change that we show his work and say, oh, he's already shown here. It rather really shows a methodology of working through this world, and really showing, which is interesting in also what you see here in purple, the complexity that we need to tackle to understand what's going on.
You know, Tim Morton's book, Being Ecological, is a really great book. You know, it's very simple, but I just like the idea that part of what we want to do is to move beyond bombarding each other with facts, or to move beyond the factoid. I like the idea that somehow practices which are not premised on the production of facts might have a place in the world that we find ourselves in. You know, I like the fact that poetry and art practice actually might have some value, you know, and if that is just to question the certainty of the hierarchy, the fix, the natural cultural axis fix, all the better.
But don't you think we should actually have mandatory visits for politicians and CEOs of companies to such art shows? Because I feel like the people feel like this, artists, writers, academics feel like this, but still on the political level and on the corporate level, this seems not to resonate.
So we'll get on that, making sure that we have many CEOs and politicians visiting both the exhibitions. We've got time for just one more question, and I can see somebody in the centre there. Anna, can we give her the mic, please? Thanks.
Thank you, John, for the enlightening speech that you gave at the beginning. I was here yesterday at the opening. I could only catch about 10 minutes of Purple. And I have two questions. One is very simple. If you could say something about the soundtrack and how you decide to accompany the images with sound. And the other one is a little bit more complex, maybe. It's about the question of beauty, or maybe I should say the sublime. And how it's mobilized in your images. I was impressed by the aesthetic force of these landscapes, or human being left alone in this vast expanse or extreme landscapes, or the industrial sublime. So I'm curious about the aesthetic strategies that lie behind.
Let's start with just the sound first. I mean, if you spend 4 decades listening to and being friends with the tonalities of different kinds, whether it's in free jazz or concrete, or at some point it does wreak its revenge. So I think I've arrived at a place where the sonic has begun to also shape the narratological principles by which we're working. So I'm not doing what I used to do in the 80s or most of the 90s, which is to have 2 distinct bits, a sonic and the imagistic, and then try and find some way in which you can bring them into a marriage. With Purple, we started with some found sounds, and because I don't shoot sound, I never shoot sound now. It's just images, and everything you see is built from scratch. 350 channels to get that soundtrack, and in order to do that, you can't just treat the sonic as a sort of afterthought or as a partner. Some sounds came to life before the images, and in that weird way in which free jazz and most improvised musics oscillate between form and improv, we arrived at what we've got. I can't be any more explicit than that because there isn't a plan, essentially. The image thing is just I'm still wrestling with the multiple legacies of Romanticism. It means a lot to me because I don't think we speak enough about the revolutionary impact of Romanticism, especially on New World slavery, because Romanticism's agnostic claims on the transcendental is one of the back doors through which the black subject came into being. It's a complicated argument to make, but it's true. So I have a kind of debt to its vision of the sublime that I keep trying to pay off. I keep hoping I'll get to a point where I'll be like, okay, I'm done, move on. But I haven't arrived there yet. And it is a complicated legacy. It does make claims which are troubling about the nature of the figure in space. But it's precisely because of that contradictory claim that it makes on the figure in space, and especially the revolutionary implications of that in the 19th century in particular, that I'm still attached to, I can't move on from it in a weird sort of way. I know it doesn't answer your question, but it's just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from with it.
Thank you very much, John. I am sure that we could continue this conversation for hours, but I'm very conscious that that Ute has to go to her own opening, and many of us will be joining her there a little later on. So I'd like to just wrap things up by saying a very, very warm thank you to both John and Ute for the insights that they've shared today. Please give them a round of applause.